We're going to start with a new scene now. We're going to go back into modifying a material. I just want to load in another sphere. Let's go and double click on that preview in order to bring up the advanced material editor. And now we can right mouse click on one of the previews and go to edit function. And we're going to create a material now. So I'm going to zoom in. And first I'm just going to remove all of those nodes that start out with the default surface. And that way we're working entirely from scratch. And we're going to start out by selecting our color output and add in a color map node. I'm going to change this to a 2-color output. And the first thing I'm going to do is just change our first color and our first color input to more of a green. And our second color is going to be a little bit of a blue and more of a bluish color. And now we really don't see that overall result because we don't have anything loaded in for the input connection. So let's go ahead and add in just a simple fractal, and we're going to connect that input for our color directly to that fractal. And if we start changing our scale, we're going to zoom out a bit. First, let's actually go ahead and change the wavelength of that. A little bit of a smaller surface. We can see we start to get sort of the results of a planet, which is kind of cool looking. So just by using these 2 colors, we can get a really neat looking effect. But right now there's no depth to this, so let's go ahead and add that bump. We're going to connect that directly to our simple fractal. And now the problem we're seeing is because the overall effect is going to apply our bump to the entire surface. And what I want to do is just make the green areas stand out. We're going to have the blue areas basically completely flat. So what we're going to use for that is a filter between the connection for our bump. So all we need to do is select that link, add in a filter. We can just reposition these overall areas. And let's go and select our sine wave. And then what we want to do is just adjust some of these values to raise up specific areas. So we can play around with the brightness and the contrast. But we can still see that a lot of those inside areas are being affected, and we really don't want that. So what we can do is add another filter node just below our sine wave, if we're going to be using the sine wave, and we can always change that out a little bit later too to modify that a little bit more. We'll add in another filter, and this time we don't want to use a sine wave, we're going to use the opposite -x. And what that will do is invert our overall surface that we have. So if I go ahead and delete that, we're going to see the exact opposite effect. And go back to that link, add in that filter, and have the opposite x. Now the sine wave might not be the best selection for this, so what we can do is use the clipping. If we can clip away certain areas of this material, and we're using the upper clip mode, just bring that down, and now we can see that only the terrain elements are really being extended, and the rest of it is a nice flat blue. And if we want to see a little bit more of the land showing up, we can go into our fractal and adjust some of our gain settings. Actually, I'm going to go back and set that to 1. We could set our roughness a little bit more. And keep in mind we're adjusting both the bump and our color right now. So if we increase our largest feature, we're going to start to see more of the land masses showing up. But we're also clipping out the top areas. So if we decrease our gain a little, we're going to see that start to disappear, and we no longer have that overall cutout at the top. Increase our roughness, make it look a little more interesting. And it's just kind of a neat little surface you can create. And let's say we wanted to vary that color of the land a little bit more, so it's not one straight green color. What we could do is extract our green and actually use a gradient map for that. So rather than extracting it and changing out the constant node that will become the parameter of that, I'm going to click to get our red box, and we're going to add in a new color node, change that to a color map, and now let's create a color map for this. We're going to set up our first color as more of a green and more of a darker green. We'll go to our first color, which is currently white, and we're going to set that to more of a yellowish green. We can go in the center, modify that a little, and just create some color variation, something a little more brown. Click OK, and now we can adjust this color of our first output, which is before was just a one constant color, but now we have a nice gradient map. But right now this gradient is not being controlled by any specific fractal, so we could either connect that directly to the fractal we had before, or we could create something new, and now we can get a little bit more color variation. So first thing I'm going to do is select our top simple fractal, and once we do that, it's going to store that information. And now if I create another fractal, we're going to have the exact same node that we just had selected. And that's a really nice thing about the function editor, is whatever node you have selected for that type, it will create another one, the same exact settings, if you want it to. So let's select that first color node, and if I add another color node, now we have a two-color output with the exact same colors. Although the extracted parameter of our gradient map is not part of it, go ahead and select our filter, which is currently set to clip. If we create a new filter, it is now clip. If we select the opposite filter, create a new one, then it's going to show up as the opposite. So it's a really nice sort of integrated copy-paste function. So we want to connect our new color map node to this simple fractal that we just created. And I'm also going to pull down the bottom of the function editor just to expand that a little more full view. And let's increase our roughness, and we can decrease our largest feature, and we can start to see a lot more of that color variation showing up within the output observer. Increase our gain if we'd like to see a lot more variation between those colors, and then we could change the scale if we wanted to, and just a lot of different settings that we have available to modify that. And if I bring out our upper clip, what we can start to do is sort of bring out the rim. If we wanted to have it just kind of touch the water a little bit of a highlight, and it looks pretty neat. But another thing I want to do is increase that overall bump. So I'm going to click OK to go into our advanced material editor, and under our bump, I'm going to change that to a depth of 2. And go back into the function, and now we can take a look. And of course that's would be a smaller planet and not necessarily something the size of Earth, because we wouldn't see that much depth because of the size. But this would be something a little bit smaller. It still looks pretty neat. But another thing I want to do is add a little bit of specular value to the water. And that way, I want to have it set up where the water has a little bit of reflection and a little bit of specularity, but the mountain areas do not, and the land would of course not have any sort of reflection or specularity at all. So we need to set that up, and it's actually quite easy. The first thing I'm going to do is just click OK. We're going to go to our highlights, and I'm going to select variable highlight. And we need to increase our global intensity of our highlight and then we're going to set up the highlight production of the areas that we don't want to be affected by that. And right now we can see that the entire surface and planet is going to be very specular. But what we want to do is change that variable, and we can do that either by right mouse clicking, going to our output node, and selecting one of the highlight settings, whether it's value or intensity, or we could go directly into our tab for highlight, where we have our highlight production, go to edit function, and then it's automatically going to add that highlight, which we already saw in there. So what we can do is directly connect that to our clip, and we don't want that opposite function showing up, because the opposite is what's defining right now our terrain and our overall land mass. So if I go ahead and connect that directly to the opposite, go ahead and move that down, then we're going to see sort of the opposite effect, where it's going to be highlighting just the land elements and not the water. So we want to go before that opposite function sets in, and now we have that variable highlight. And I just want to increase the roughness that we have for our land, so we can go ahead and increase that value just a little, make it have a little bit more detail, maybe bring that wavelength down to 0.15, and that's mainly adjusting our color right now. But let's go ahead and take a look, just a little bit of a render. Click OK to save that out. And I want to change our atmosphere, so I'm going to load a new atmosphere in. We're going to take a look at effects. And under others, we have this black back, or we can use outer space. So let's go ahead and select outer space. And we want to delete our ground plane. And now we're just going to see that planet surface with a nice background of stars. I'm going to go into our sphere, and I'm just going to change the size variation a little. Let's go ahead and just render out a frame and take a look. So we can right mouse click on that top camera, and I'm just going to set this to a final render. And we'll do an 800 by 450 render. Just go ahead and render that out. And now we can see the highlights are showing up a little bit along the edges, so we might need to modify that clip a little. But overall, we get a pretty neat looking effect. We can see we have some cutout on a lot of our detail. So what we might need to do is bring down that gain, and that way we won't be clipping out that top part of the surface. So let's go back into the material for this. We can go into there in our first simple fractal, which is controlling the overall color displacement. And we could decrease our gain. We could also go into the clip and modify the brightness and contrast values. And we can see that also has a very large effect on the areas that we're removing from the surface. We'll go ahead and click OK. And let's do another render. And we can see we've removed a lot of the clipping areas. Let's go ahead and move to a different lighting option, just a little bit from the side. And let's take a look back in the function editor for our highlight production. And what I want to do is create a filter in between our link. There's a lot of different filters we can use. Right now we have the clip set up. We could also set up just a standard filter, which will allow us to modify with different points, and this will adjust our overall color an overall highlight on the right. We can set that to curves, add a couple of new points, and then we can set up the overall contrast of that. And we can really see that showing up. Go ahead and exit out of that. We can change this to a partial filter, which will work the same way, except we can ease in and out of that filter with the filter ratio, which works kind of like the combiner did before in the ratio. We'll just go ahead and remove that. We could also add in a math node to do a lot of the different functions that the filters will do, but sort of a straightforward operation without really any modified parts. We can go ahead and invert that, set that based on power, square root, and modify that overall effect. Another thing we could do to make this a little more interesting is to set up a turbulence node. And I'm going to use the advanced turbulence. And we're going to connect the origin of our original fractal that we created to that turbulence. Increase our roughness and amplitude. And now we can see a much more varied surface, something a little more interesting. And then we can change that noises to Voronoi. You can see a lot of detail in there now. Increase the roughness, maybe decrease that amplitude a little. We're going to click OK. Let's go ahead and render that out. We can see a little more interesting of a surface now. Sort of little islands, lots of twisting in there. But a fairly neat and simple surface, just by using a couple of different nodes. Another thing we can do is animate the overall landmass that we have. So if we go back into the function editor, we're going to select that main fractal, and I'm just going to remove that turbulence for right now. And we can see what we had before. But if we go into that fractal, we can select Edit and turn on Animated. And what that will do is create a connection and a new link that goes to our time setting. Within that time setting, we can also set up various filters and math nodes to modify the speed and other variables of that time. I'm going to click OK. And let's just create a small preview of this. So first what I need to do is create a little bit of an animation so we can see that. So I'm going to go to our display timeline and show timeline. Let's just go in about 3 seconds. And I'm going to create a position keyframe. And we're not really modifying the position, but creating that keyframe will activate our animation. And now what we can do is just create a preview. So we can see the tabs on the bottom. I'm going to click our innermost, third one, and that's going to create a little bit of a preview of that. But it's very small, and we can't really see what's going on. So we want to modify our preview options, which we can do by right mouse clicking on this film. And I'm going to set our preview rate up to 24 frames per second, preview size to 4 times, so it's nice and large, and click OK, and that will start to render out our preview. And we'll be able to take a look at that animated fractal node. So now that our preview is finished rendering, we can sort of scrub through the animation, and you can see all those changes with just a basic animated fractal. And a lot of the animation options for this are basically one preset. So there's not a lot of options we have to really modify that overall effect. But one thing you could do is just use an animated texture map, and that way you can control exactly where all the elevation is going to be, and of course the clipping as well. And it can sometimes be a little bit easier just to use those animated maps rather than the straight fractal animated function. And I found the easiest way to actually adjust speed is just to increase the frame amount per second. So you could render several hundred frames a second, and then play that back at a lower frame rate. And then it will slow it down. And that can be very helpful. But let's take a look at some of our other options. So I'm going to create a new scene, just daytime, using spectral sunshine, and then our default sky. And we'll click OK, and I'm not going to save that. And this time we're going to load in just a standard terrain. And we'll just frame our camera a little bit. And I want to make this a little bit of a higher resolution, so I can just double click on the terrain to open up the terrain editor. Click times 2 times, so we have 1024 by 1024 for our pixel resolution. Click on mountain again, and we'll get a little bit of a higher detail. And then let's double click on that surface to open up the advanced material editor and go into the function editor. And we're going to create color now based on the altitude of our terrain. So I'm going to remove all of those default nodes. We're going to go to color. We're going to add in a color map node. And we'll start out by loading in a gradient for that. So we can right mouse click on the color map, load color map node, or load color map for our node. And then select our sandstone and click OK. And now we want to connect this color map to our altitude. And if we take a look, we can see we have that more of a yellow color on top, and then that red or orange color on the bottom. And then that little bit of a blend in between. If we click OK, we're really not going to see a whole lot in the terrain right now because of the way our settings are currently set up for this. It's a very straight line, not a whole lot of variation. So what we need to do is add in a couple of other nodes to really define how we want to adjust that altitude. So the first thing I want to add in our connection is a filter. And if you go to the edit filter, normally by default we will just have that straight line. But if we take that point on the right and just move that down, we can create a nice gradient between our two different colors. And click OK, and that'll bring us out into actually being able to preview the surface. So let's go ahead and render that out, and we'll be able to see the effects of that a little bit better. We'll set that to a final render, render to screen, do something a little bit larger, 1024 by 576, and I'm also using a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. We'll just go ahead and render that out. And now you can see we are very easily creating a nice blend between colors based on the altitude of our terrain. We'll go ahead and close that out, and we can make a little bit of a more varied terrain. I'm going to select a couple of different options. And I'm just going to reset this, create a mountain, and then I'm going to go to our options, and under altitude distribution, I'm going to modify this filter just a little. And now we have a little bit more variation within the production of our elevation. And I want to modify where our sun is located, so we'll go to the atmosphere editor, increase our pitch, change the azimuth. I'm also going to turn on global illumination and decrease our light balance more towards the ambient side, so it'll look a little bit nicer. and we have a little more of a overall color blend, something more of an overcast. We can go ahead and render that out. We'll see it just a little bit better. And now we can see with a little more varied terrain the nice gradient between the two colors based on altitude. And if we needed to increase the altitude of this actual terrain, and let's just raise that up a bit higher, and take a look at our blend. Because we are in parametric mode, it is going to stretch that gradient along with the terrain, and we don't need to worry about adjusting the filter. But if we were working with object standard mode or world standard mode, then what you can do is just modify that filter. If we go back into the function editor, just that filter we created, maybe bring it up a little bit further, and then you'll be able to adjust that altitude, or maybe even bring it down, it really depending on the size of your object. But let's move this over to a different object now. I'm just going to click OK, and we're going to right mouse click on our preview, copy the material, just delete our terrain out of here, and add in another sphere. We can move that up, reposition our camera a little, and then I right mouse click on our material preview and paste. Now we have that material loaded onto a sphere, and we can take a look at some of the other options. We can also attach this to slope, and if we take a look, now we can see the higher areas with the one color in sort of a similar effect, but this time it is entirely based on the slope of the object. And we can modify other variables as well. I'm going to start out by working on a new material now, and we can delete this link, and we'll add in a color map node, and I'm going to select in here and add a combiner. So we'll connect our color to our combiner node, which is set to blender, and I'm going to leave that at blender. And I'm going to add another color map node and edit our color map. Actually, I'll just load in one of our presets. I'll use the foliage under rocks and grass. And I'm going to connect to our color output both of these inputs for input 1 and 2 of our blender. And we need to distribute these gradient maps a little. So we're going to add in some fractal nodes, and we'll just connect those. We'll add in another one. And we want to modify these so we can see that a little bit better. I'll reduce our wavelength on both of these, doing 0.1 on the first input and 0.2 all the way across on the second input. Increase our roughness. I'm also going to zoom out and decrease our scale of our preview. But right now we just have a blend between these two with the standard ratio. But what I'm going to do is take our ratio and connect this to our altitude. Now right now it's going to give us some very extreme colors. So I'll go in here and add in a filter. And we can edit that filter just as we did before. And then if we take a look at our sphere, we can see the green on the top and the red on the bottom. So that's a really cool way we could set up that specific effect. And I'll go ahead and render that out. I'm going to go into our atmosphere editor and just set this to global ambience and an 800 by 450 render, and we can take a look at that. And of course, the more we adjust that filter, the more we can adjust the blend between these two materials based on our altitude. We'll go back into the function editor. We could also attach that to slope, which is going to work similarly. We'll go ahead and render that out. So we can see on the top, very similar type of effect, but based on the slope value, and since this is on a sphere, that overall slope is basically the same. So let's add in just a standard terrain, and it's already going to have that material from our selected object when we created it. And I just want to move our sphere out of the way just a little. Go ahead and select that in our layers. Oh, undo. We want to make sure we're in the move gizmo and not the stretching. And you can also see this terrain is being created with that filter we had created before. We can go ahead and render that out. And now we can see that blend on a slope. So we could create more realistic looking materials and create a very interesting looking terrain material, either based on altitude or slope or both, because we can combine multiple nodes to work that way. Go back into the function editor. And let's take a look at something else now. We'll create a new material. Just clear all of that out. Click OK just to get that into our scene.